June 6, 1944, Normandy coast, France. Dawn breaking over the English Channel. Major Werner Pluscat, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division's artillery regiment from his concrete observation post overlooking Omaha Beach near Colleville-sur-Mer, stood at his viewing slit scanning the grey ocean with binoculars as reports filtered in of paratroop landings inland during the night, of naval gunfire support beginning at first light, and of unusual naval activity visible through the morning mist that shrouded the channel, when suddenly the fog began lifting to reveal a sight so overwhelming that Pluscat later described the moment as making his blood freeze. The entire horizon from west to east was covered with ships, thousands of vessels of every description, from battleships to landing craft, stretching as far as he could see in both directions. The largest armada ever assembled in human history, carrying the Allied invasion force that would establish the Second Front in Western Europe that Germany had dreaded since 1943, and that now was materializing despite German defensive preparations. Despite the Atlantic Wall, fortifications Rommel had supervised, and despite Hitler's confident predictions that any Allied landing attempt would be thrown back into the sea within hours through counterattacks by panzer divisions held in reserve for precisely this contingency. Pluscat grabbed the telephone connecting him to his superior at 352nd Division headquarters and reported what he was seeing, his voice reflecting the shock and the dawning realization that the war Germany had been fighting on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces was now about to become a two-front war that German military resources could not sustain, and that would force German armies to fight simultaneously against enemies attacking from east and west, while Germany's industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and strategic mobility were already strained beyond sustainable levels. The German military command structure in France on June 6, 1944, was complex and dysfunctional, divided between multiple authorities with overlapping jurisdictions and competing strategic visions about how to defend against the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming, but whose location and timing remained uncertain. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, 78 years old and representing the old Prussian military aristocracy, commanded all German forces in the West from his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris, but his actual authority was limited by Hitler's direct control over panzer reserves and by the semi-independent command Field Marshal Erwin Rommel exercised over Army Group B, responsible for defending the coast from Netherlands through Normandy. Rommel, 52 years old, and Germany's most famous general because of his earlier exploits in North Africa, believed that defeating the Allied invasion required stopping the landing forces on the beaches before they could establish beachheads, and he had spent months since November 1943 supervising construction of beach obstacles, laying millions of mines, and positioning artillery to create killing zones that would destroy Allied forces as they came ashore. Rundstedt believed that defeating the invasion required holding panzer divisions inland in mobile reserves that could counterattack once the Allies committed to their main landing site, rather than dispersing armor near the coast where Allied naval gunfire and air superiority would destroy tanks before they could be used effectively. This strategic disagreement between Rommel's forward defense and Rundstedt's mobile reserve doctrine had never been fully resolved, with Hitler characteristically refusing to choose decisively between competing approaches and instead creating compromise that satisfied neither commander while reducing effectiveness of both strategies. 3 panzer divisions, including the powerful 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and Panzerlehr Division, were positioned north of the Seine River in Normandy, where they could potentially support either the Normandy coast or the Pas-de-Calais area that German intelligence assessed as the most likely invasion site. But these divisions could not be committed to combat without Hitler's personal authorization, which meant that hours would elapse between the invasion beginning and German armor being released to counterattack, hours during which Allied forces would be establishing beachheads and bringing ashore the artillery and anti-tank weapons that would make German counterattacks far more difficult than if the panzers had been positioned closer to beaches as Rommel wanted. The confusion that characterized German response during the critical first hours of D-Day resulted from multiple factors, including deception operations that convinced German intelligence the main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, bad weather that led German commanders to believe invasion was unlikely during early June, and Rommel's absence from France because he had traveled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday on June 6th and to personally lobby Hitler for transfer of additional panzer divisions to his command. When the invasion began, the officer best positioned to coordinate German defensive response was visiting his family hundreds of miles from the battle, and the command structure remaining in France was paralyzed by regulations requiring Hitler's authorization for major decisions and by unwillingness of subordinate commanders to take initiatives that might later be criticized if they proved wrong. Admiral Theodor Krank, commanding Naval Group Command west from Paris, received first reports of Allied naval activity around 2 a.m. when German radar stations detected ships approaching Normandy coast and when the few German patrol boats operating in the Channel reported sighting Allied vessels. But Kranke's forces were pitifully weak compared to the Allied armada, bearing down on Normandy. The Kriegsmarine maintained perhaps 36 smaller vessels, including torpedo boats and minesweepers in Channel ports, while the Allied invasion fleet included 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, over 100 destroyers, and thousands of transport and landing vessels protected by overwhelming Allied air superiority that made German naval operations virtually suicidal during daylight. Kranke ordered his available vessels to attack the invasion fleet, but these attacks were conducted by small fast boats launching torpedoes from long range before retreating, and they had no meaningful effect on the landings or on the naval bombardment that supported Allied forces coming ashore. The Luftwaffe response was even more ineffective despite Hermann Göring's boastful promises that German air power would destroy any invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe could muster perhaps 300 operational aircraft in France on June 6th, compared to Allied air forces numbering over 10,000 planes, including fighters, bombers, and transport aircraft that completely dominated French airspace and that shot down nearly every German plane that attempted to attack the beachheads. German pilots who did reach the invasion area described skies filled with Allied aircraft, with naval anti-aircraft fire so dense that flying through it was nearly impossible, and with the overwhelming sense that this was not a battle the Luftwaffe could contest, but was instead a defeat so complete that German air forces were irrelevant to the outcome. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding 7th Army responsible for defending Normandy coast, was attending a command post exercise in Rennes on the night of June 5th to 6th. And many of his subordinate commanders were away from their posts because German intelligence had assessed that weather conditions made invasion unlikely during early June. When reports began arriving of paratroop landings and of naval activity, Dollmann's staff initially interpreted these as diversionary operations rather than as the main invasion, reflecting the success of Allied deception operations that had convinced German commanders the real invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. Even after dawn revealed the massive fleet off Normandy beaches, German commanders clung to beliefs that this might be secondary attack designed to draw German reserves away from Pas-de-Calais, where the real invasion would land later, a misperception that delayed German reinforcements to Normandy and that gave Allied forces additional hours to consolidate beachheads without facing full German strength. The psychological impact on German commanders who actually witnessed the Allied fleet was devastating and disorienting. Officers who had been told that German defenses were impregnable, that the Atlantic War would prevent successful invasion, and that any Allied landing attempt would be defeated through counterattacks by superior German armor, suddenly confronted reality that completely contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. The sheer scale of Allied logistics, the thousands of ships, the continuous flow of men and material coming ashore, the naval gunfire that destroyed German strong points, the aerial armada that prevented German aircraft from even approaching the battle area, demonstrated Allied material superiority so overwhelming that German military skill and tactical competence could not compensate. Major Pluscat's telephone conversation with his division headquarters captured the shock and the desperate hope that what was happening could not be real. According to post-war accounts, when Pluscat reported seeing the immense fleet, his superior asked what direction they were heading. Pluscat reportedly replied, "Right at me." The exchange reflected both the immediate danger to German positions on the beaches and the broader realization that this was not a raid or a limited operation, but was the full-scale invasion that would determine the war's outcome, and that German forces positioned to resist it were pitifully inadequate despite months of preparation and despite confident German propaganda about defensive strength. Rundstedt learned of the invasion early on June 6th, when his chief of staff, General Günther Blumentritt, informed him of paratrooper landings and naval activity off Normandy. Rundstedt's response was to request authorization from Hitler's headquarters to release panzer reserves for immediate counterattack, believing that the critical window for defeating the invasion was the first few hours before Allied forces could establish strong beachheads and before Allied naval gunfire could be fully coordinated to support forces ashore. But Hitler's headquarters, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKWs at Berchtesgaden, was reluctant to wake Hitler, who had taken sleeping medication and who had given strict orders not to be disturbed, and OKW staff officers were unwilling to authorize panzer release without Hitler's personal approval. This bureaucratic paralysis cost Germany crucial hours when the panzer divisions might have been moved forward to positions where they could contest Allied beachheads before American, British and Canadian forces could bring ashore their full strength. By the time Hitler woke and was informed of the invasion around 10 a.m., Allied forces had been ashore for hours. Beachheads were being expanded despite fierce German resistance at Omaha Beach and elsewhere, and Allied air forces had made German troop movements during daylight extremely difficult and costly. Hitler's initial reaction was reportedly satisfaction that the Allies had finally committed to invasion, and that German forces could now destroy them, reflecting the Führer's consistent overestimation of German military capabilities and his refusal to accept that Allied material superiority had created conditions where German tactical skill could not produce strategic victory. Hitler authorized release of some panzer reserves, but continued to insist that the Normandy landings might be diversionary, and that strong forces must be maintained near Pas de Calais to defend against the real invasion, a misperception that Allied deception operations sustained for weeks and that prevented German forces in France from concentrating fully against the actual Allied beachheads in Normandy. Rommel learned of the invasion while driving back to France from Germany, receiving telephone call from his chief of staff informing him that the invasion he had spent months preparing to defeat was underway and that the defenses he had supervised were being tested by enemy forces with material advantages far exceeding German estimates. Rommel's response was reportedly stunned silence, followed by questions about where panzers were and whether counterattacks had been launched, reflecting his belief that rapid response during the first hours was essential, and that delays would make defeating the invasion impossible. When Rommel reached his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon late on June 6th, he found that his worst fears had been realized. German beach defenses had inflicted casualties on Allied forces, but had not prevented landings. Panzer divisions had not yet reached battle areas because of Hitler's delays in authorizing their movement, and Allied air superiority was so complete that German reinforcements were suffering heavy casualties while moving to Normandy. Rommel's assessment to his staff was reportedly that the battle was already lost, that German forces could not defeat the invasion given Allied advantages in material and air power, and that Germany needed to seek political settlement before the military situation became completely hopeless. An assessment that his staff officers considered treasonous defeatism, but that events would prove correct as Allied forces gradually pushed German armies back across France during subsequent months. The alternative scenarios that might have emerged from different German decisions reveal how constrained German options actually were, and how Allied material superiority made German defeat likely regardless of tactical choices. If Rommel had been present on June 6th, and if panzer divisions had been released immediately for counterattacks, Allied beachheads might have been contested more effectively during critical first hours. But Allied naval gunfire and air superiority would still have made German armored operations extremely difficult and costly. If Hitler had authorized panzer release earlier, German counterattacks might have reached beaches before Allied forces had fully established defensive positions. But the fundamental Allied advantages in numbers, logistics, and firepower would still have favored the invaders, even if German tactical responses had been more effective. If Germany had concentrated all available forces in France against Normandy landings instead of maintaining divisions at Pas-de-Calais to defend against secondary invasion that never came, Allied forces would have faced stronger initial resistance. But Allied material advantages meant that additional German divisions would have been destroyed in Normandy, rather than surviving to fight later defensive battles. The strategic reality was that by June 1944, Germany was fighting war on three fronts: against Soviets in the East, against Western allies in Italy, and now against Anglo-American forces in France. While Germany's industrial production, manpower reserves, and strategic mobility were inadequate to sustain simultaneous operations against enemies whose combined resources exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude. The broader context that made D-Day strategically decisive was not just the immediate tactical success of the landings, but the demonstration that Allied forces could conduct complex amphibious operations against defended coastline and could sustain logistics necessary to support major armies in France. German strategy since 1943 had relied on preventing Second Front from opening, on maintaining defensive positions in East, while hoping for political settlement with either Western allies or Soviet Union, and on buying time for wonder weapons including V-weapons and jet aircraft to alter strategic balance. D-Day's success destroyed these hopes by establishing the Second Front that Germany could not eliminate, and by beginning liberation of Western Europe that would culminate in Germany's defeat 11 months later. What German commanders said when they saw the Allied fleet on D-Day was that the invasion they had expected was actually happening, that the scale exceeded their estimates despite months of intelligence collection and defensive preparation, that the Allied material superiority was so overwhelming that German tactical advantages could not compensate, and that the war's outcome would be determined by which side could sustain losses and replace forces over extended campaign rather than by who won initial battles on the beaches. Officers who witnessed the landings described feelings of awe at Allied logistical capabilities, of frustration that German air and naval forces could not contest the landings effectively, and of dawning realization that this was beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and that defeat was now inevitable regardless of how bravely individual German soldiers fought or how skillfully German commanders employed their limited resources. The human dimension of German commanders' responses included not just military assessments, but personal reckonings with what Allied invasion meant for their futures and for their families. Many German officers by June 1944 recognized that Germany would lose the war, that the question was not whether defeat would come, but how soon and under what conditions. Some, like Rommel, were already involved in conspiracies against Hitler that would culminate in failed July 20th assassination attempt, believing that Germany needed to remove Hitler and seek negotiated peace before total military collapse. Others maintained loyalty to Hitler and to Nazi ideology, despite recognizing military situation was hopeless, continuing to fight because surrender meant accepting defeat they could not emotionally endure, or because they feared consequences of Nazi Germany's crimes and hoped that continued resistance might produce better terms than unconditional surrender. The sight of thousands of Allied ships approaching French coast represented not just immediate military threat, but broader historical judgment on Nazi Germany and on the attempt to establish German hegemony over Europe through military conquest. German commanders who had fought in World War I and who remembered Germany's previous defeat were experiencing déjà vu as history repeated itself, with Germany again facing enemies with superior resources, fighting wars of attrition that German strategy could not win. The younger officers who had known only Nazi Germany and who had been taught that German military superiority was racial destiny were confronting reality that contradicted everything their ideology claimed, and that suggested the entire Nazi worldview was based on lies that material reality was now exposing. What German commanders said when they saw the Allied invasion fleet was that the war had entered its final phase, that German defensive strategy had failed to prevent what everyone had known was coming, and that from June 6th forward, Germany would be fighting delaying actions and managed retreats rather than conducting operations aimed at victory. They recognized that Allied material advantages, visible in the thousands of ships, would continue through subsequent campaign, that German forces would face constant Allied air attack, that German logistics would struggle to maintain supply lines under air interdiction, and that gradually Allied numerical superiority and unlimited logistics would grind down German resistance regardless of how skillfully German commanders employed their forces or how bravely German soldiers fought against overwhelming odds. They were professional military officers doing their duty as they understood it, but they were also human beings recognizing that their cause was lost, that the ideology they had served had led Germany to catastrophe, and that history would judge them not as heroes defending their homeland, but as servants of criminal regime whose defeat was justice rather than tragedy.